Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Miller, and welcome to the second lecture on the Jain layperson. This lecture will follow Paul Dundas' book, The Jains, pages 204 to 226. We'll consider, among other things in this lecture, other Jain lay practices that we didn't look at in the first part, such as pilgrimage, as you see here pictured in the image on the title card. The topics that we'll cover specifically are forms of devotional worship, Dravya puja. We talked in the last lecture about icons and temples. Well, we'll look in more detail at how the actual devotion is carried out to the images within the temples, within the sects of Jains who do worship images and temples. We'll also look at goddess worship, a sort of side project, but very central project to the Jain devotional worship. We'll also look at the lay forms of festival within the Jain tradition. Okay, there are a lot of Hindu festivals, but there are also Jain festivals, many of which overlap with the Hindu festivals. And we'll look at lay pilgrimage, as we saw in the title card, and some of the most important holy places in the Jain tradition. To begin, we'll look at puja. Puja is a pan-South Asian phenomenon where devotion is given to some form of divinity, either a god or a goddess. In the Jain tradition, though, it takes on very specific forms and meaning that don't exactly align with the types of meaning that we find in the Hindu traditions, for example. Within the Digambara tradition, broadly speaking, they do not touch the image, okay? And the actual devotion itself, the puja, is carried out by a priest, an upadhyay. Within the Shvetambara tradition, lay people actually carry it out. Okay, there's someone known as a pujari who is usually not a Jain who will clean up afterwards. And sometimes in the absence of lay people, the pujari can themselves carry out the puja on behalf of the community. Okay, so there's differences between the sects. The upadhyay and the pujari, as Dundas carefully points out, and this is an important distinction for the Jain tradition, are not mediators with the Ford makers, meaning they are not talking to or bringing the Ford makers' power into the world, per se, because the Ford makers, being liberated as they are, have no attachment to the world, have no care or concern anymore to be part of the world. And so this devotion, as you'll see, has other meanings and connotations that come up, and we'll look at what those are throughout this lecture. One of those things is that one is taking an outward look, darshana. As you'll recall, the word darshana can mean when one looks at an image or an icon. That happens also in the Hindu tradition, right? An outward look. Remember, darshana comes from the verbal root darsh, which means to see in Sanskrit. So one's taking an outward look at the image of the Tirthankara or the Ford maker, and at the same time cultivating an inner disposition, a bhava, right? A state of being, mental and emotional being within oneself as a result. They're taking inspiration from the image, but they're not asking it for anything. This is a key distinction in the Jain tradition, that the approach to an icon, or one's approach to an icon, is not to unite with the icon or get anything from the icon. The only thing they're trying to do is create an inner disposition of inspiration to be like that icon, to live the life of nonviolence that that icon and what it represents has lived, right? So Mahavira, for example. In the image to the right, you see a lay devotee carrying out puja. You'll also notice that there's rice that is in the particular form of a swastika or swastikas on here. These are some of the substances that are used in Jain puja. As you recall from a prior lecture, the use of the image of the swastika has nothing to do with Hitler's Nazi Germany, right? And it's originally used in the Jain tradition to be just, or to represent just the opposite of that. It's a reminder of one's place in the universe, as we'll see in a future slide, and a reminder that one must actually perfect non-violence, not violence as in the Hitler Germany, right? Non-violence in order to be liberated, right? So Hitler inverted the meaning of this image and even turned the image for his own purposes. But within the Jain tradition, it represents the opposite. It represents the need to perfect non-violence and to get out of the wheel of samsara. And we'll look into that in more detail in a future slide. Just notice, though, that the rice is put in that formation, and we'll see it again. as Dundas points out, the origins of puja are obscure. Okay, puja, this devotional practice, such as you see here in London taking place, the morning puja taking place in London, the origins of this practice are obscure, right? They developed first in Hinduism and then in Buddhism, and then later in the Jain tradition. So Jainism is the last to kind of catch on with this devotional worship. And there's reasons for that historically. One being that at first, these were just people going out into the forest to practice austerities and perfect nonviolence, right? They weren't concerned with ritual. In fact, the Jains, as I said in the last lecture, rejected ritual. They rejected the ritual sacrifice of Vedic Hinduism, and therefore they wouldn't be practicing it. In fact, it doesn't get developed until much later, although its origins are obscure. We don't know exactly where it comes from. It's likely related to, however, the second obligatory action, which requires praise to the Ford makers. We looked at the 6 obligatory actions in a lecture about ascetic practice a few lectures back. And so this need to give devotion to the Ford makers in some way, shape, or form likely contributed to what became this Jain form of puja or devotional worship, because it is through the worship and through the puja that one does praise the Ford makers and looks up to them as inspiration, right? It's a very material, measurable way of doing that, as you can see in this beautiful image to the right, where 2 devotees are anointing the image, as we'll see in future videos, and giving great respect to it, okay? The original form of puja was simply to bathe the image. This is common in Hinduism too, to perform a ritual bath in various substances, starting with water, but then that could also include other things like milk and honey and so on and so forth. By the 6th century of the Common Era, as Dundas points out, the Digambara and the Shvetambara agree on 8 substances. So beyond just giving a bath in water or something like that, 8 primary substances are agreed upon, this is quite a long time ago in the 6th century CE, that are still used to this day in order to perform what's known as Dravya puja. Dravya means substance, so this is puja that uses actual substances, and it's these 8 substances that are still used to this day in Jain puja. Let's look at what they are. The image is anointed with these 8 substances, right? Anointed as in their actual material substances that are put onto the image, right? Only lay people can perform this. They can only purchase these Dravya substances, for example, right? Because ascetics are not allowed to purchase things, right? As you see in number 3 here, ascetics can't own or buy anything to offer, whereas lay people can go and actually buy and procure these substances to perform the puja. Also, ascetics cannot perform the Dravya puja because they're not allowed to be attached to external objects, right? You're trying to get rid of all your passions and attachments, and even to images of the Tirthankaras. So you can't be attached to anything external. And so Dravya puja, which involves substances and images, would be not allowed for an ascetic to undertake. And number 2, ascetics don't wash and are therefore impure according to some parts of Jainism, right? It's not to say that they're impure, bad people. It's just to say that because they're trying to perfect nonviolence, they don't wash themselves, and therefore they would not be allowed within the proximity of the image or to touch the image, which is itself, from the lay perspective, pure. The 8 substances that are still used to this day, right, that go all the way back to the 6th century of the Common Era, are the following. There's some sort of perfumed material like camphor, something that smells really nice. And someday, if you haven't already, I hope you go into a Jain temple or a Hindu temple even, you get to experience some of these substances. Some of them are shared, of course, with the Hindus. So there's some sort of perfumed material offered to the image of the Tirthankara. Some flowers, right? Some beautiful flowers. Some rice, right? Some, as we saw before, and put in the form of the swastika. Some incense, again, something that smells really nice, is offered. Light, usually in the form of fire, or almost always in the form of fire, in the oddity lamps. So these lamps are waved in front of the image. And then finally, sweets, something sweet, so some food. Fruit, another thing that can be consumed and is delicious. And water. Okay, so water was the original substance, but then look, there's these other 7 that are added on. Okay, so water, being a universal thing, was actually, as you can see here, added later. So the first 5 were an original list of their own, and then 6 through 8 were added later. Although water is kind of a universal pan-Indic puja substance. It's the easiest to procure, and you can give the substance a bath no matter which tradition you're in, Jain, Hindu, or Buddhist, or whatever. Okay, so here to the right we have a beautiful image of the Ashta Dravya Puja. Ashta means 8, Dravya means substance, and Puja means form of devotion. So 8 substance puja. Here they are all laid out on a tray, ready to be offered in devotion to the Ford makers. And we'll look at the sequence of the Dravya Puja. So how is it carried out? Well, as Dundas notes, there is a sequence given. This is the Shvetambara sequence that we're going to look at here, not the Digambara, but it's often improvisational in nature. Okay, so it will change from time to time. Even though similar or same substances are used, the way it's carried out isn't always exactly the same as you would see, like, for example, in the Catholic Church, when the liturgy of the Eucharist or the Eucharist is carried out, and it's done very methodically and almost exactly the same in every place you go to. It's going to be very improvisational within the Jain tradition. The first substance that is used is water, okay? And again, water, easiest to procure, is used to bathe the image, right? And sometimes milk is also used here. So some liquid is used and poured over the image to give it a bath. The second is some form of perfumed material known as gund. Okay, gund relates to the sense of smell, gund in Sanskrit, ganda. And this is usually, again, camphor or sandalwood, something that smells really nice, and it's added to the image as well, right? This material is actually placed onto the image itself, various colors. And finally, number 3, flowers. So for this first stage, 1, 2, and 3, we have water, perfume material, and then flowers, and perhaps even a garland is presented to the image. As Dundas points out, steps 1 through 3 involve some kind of physical contact. Then steps 4 through 8 are performed outside the sanctum. Let's take a look at steps 1 through 3 carefully in this following video. So as we can see here from this video, quite a festive occasion. And we did see all of these substances, the water. We saw the water being dried. We saw perfume material being added, and we saw flowers also being added, right? We also saw incense and fire as well. And these are indeed some of the other things that are offered in these Dravya Pujas. Incense is waved in the direction of the image, so a really nice smelling substance is waved in the direction of the image. Fire for light is given with these lamps that are waved or set down next to the image. And then finally, rice is offered. So first, in this next video, we're just going to show how some of the fire lamps are waved in the direction of the image to give some form of devotion, and that's really coming straight from the heart, as you'll see in this celebratory video. of the Tirthankaras in this puja.
स्वामी जय महावीर प्रभो कुंडलपुर अवतारी चांदनपुर अवतारी त्रिशूलानंद विभो ओम जय महावीर प्रभो ओम जय महावीर प्रभो स्वामी जय
Okay, so you can see this is also quite a festive occasion. And again, going back all the way to the first lecture, when we talked about all these stereotypes of Jains as sort of austere and colorless and so on and so forth, we can see in the living Jain lay tradition that this is absolutely not true. These are real people with real lives, really celebrating their tradition and really celebrating the Ford makers in a way that is quite colorful, vibrant, and nice to, if you're ever able to, participate in. Okay, so that you see there, the fire lamps being waved in the direction of the image as a form of devotion. People are all dressed up. And then you see here to the right, rice is offered. Okay, so way back in that slide before at the beginning of the lecture, you saw the image of the Jain lay woman who had laid the rice down in the form of the swastikas all over the tray in front of her. Why is that? Well, she's recreating the image here essentially of the loka. And this is often what will happen when people use rice as the substance, okay? And what they do is they'll make a swastika, as you see here, and they'll put the 3 jewels, they'll put 3 little blotches of rice above that to represent the 3 jewels, and then 1 little blotch at the very top to represent, as you see here, the liberated beings of general, the liberated souls of Jainism, right? Those who have made it all the way up to the top of the loka, and such as the Tirthankaras and the Kevalins, those who are possessed of liberation. Now, the swastika in particular is an interesting object within the Jain tradition. And as I said before, it gets tied in with Hitler's Germany later when Hitler appropriates it for the exact opposite reason of why the Jains use it. Because the Jains use it as a foundation for understanding the need to commit oneself to non-violence, right? What does it represent symbolically? One of the most popular interpretations of the swastika within the Jain tradition is that it shows the 4 different types of beings within this world of transmigration and rebirth, starting with, as you can see, humans at the top, gods to the right, hell beings at the bottom, and animals to the left. This swastika, you might understand, is something that's like turning around. It's a constant wheel of transmigration because your soul within the Jain worldview can reincarnate, right? Every time you die, it reincarnates as something else according to its karma. So if you have really good karma, you might be reborn as a human. You might even be reborn as a Jain. You might even be reborn as a Jain ascetic and then maybe even achieve liberation, right? You can also be reborn as a god. So if you do a lot of really good things in this life, you could be reborn in a future life as a god. And as a god with great karma, you live out your good karma and you enjoy life, but you can't be liberated as a god. And eventually you'll have to come back down into the human realm, if you're lucky, be reborn as a human, if not something else, and then work your way back up towards liberation, right? Otherwise, if you have bad karma, you could be born as a hell being, right? So there's always a chance you could go down to becoming a hell being, right? For doing really awful things, and no matter what form you're in. Or you could be born as an animal, right? In the animal or plant kingdom as a 1 through 5 sense being that is an animal. Now, again, the ideal here is to go up into that human realm. And you can see that the human realm is the only realm of the swastika that points upwards. It points upwards because that's the only chute or tunnel or gateway through which you can achieve liberation and go to the top of the loka. You must be born as a human. And so in the Dravya puja sequence, to use rice every time, this very sacred substance in India, because it's the basis of all life, right? To use this sacred substance to continually, every time you perform the puja, recreate this swastika, is to make a fundamental commitment One, to this idea of death and rebirth and the need to escape from it as a human being, to do your best to perfect nonviolence. Two, to acknowledge the three jewels of Jainism, the three jewels that all Jains ascribe to: right faith, right knowledge, and right behavior. And then three, to be able to acknowledge that there is a possibility that one can go all the way to the top of the loka. At some point, their soul can be liberated from the suffering in the world, as represented again by the swastika. No more rebirth. Okay, so that's what it means, especially in the sequence of the Dravya Puja within the Jain tradition. And then at the bottom of this image, you again see written in Sanskrit, Parasparo Pagraho Jivanam. The function of souls is to help one another, right? So that's why we're here. We're here to help each other in towards liberation. And the Dravya Puja sequence is to remind us of our place as humans, to be very lucky to be humans within this worldview. The seventh and eighth substances that are offered in the Dravya Puja sequence are sweets and fruit. So these are the edibles. And it's not uncommon, of course, within a Hindu puja to offer sweets and fruit and other edibles to the image, the deity, whether god or goddess. And it's believed within Hinduism, generally speaking, that the god or goddess will actually consume that offering, and then it will be left behind for the devotees to consume after, right? So essentially it's imbued with divinity in Hinduism. And then as the devotee, you can take it and eat it yourself, and then you yourself are part of that divinity, right? Well, in the Jain tradition, it doesn't work that way, right? Because there is no ultimate godhead in Jainism, as we've said before. The Tirthankaras are merely representations. The images are merely representations of souls that are liberated and completely not of this world. They are totally beyond this world now, right? They don't care. They're not here to take care of you per se, right? They're there to be an inspiration to you. So although sweets and fruit are also offered in the Jain tradition, it's done according to the cultural and religious logic of Jainism. Okay, so in that case, the sweets and fruit are not understood to be eaten by the image, by the icon, by the Tirthankara. The Tirthankara doesn't need to eat anything. Nevertheless, the devotees, the pujari will consume the food as a devotee would, right, in the Hindu tradition. In this case, the pujari, whoever is the one undertaking the puja itself and cleaning up after the puja, will be the one who will consume the fruit or sweets. And in some cases, that is done as a form of payment as well, to commission them to actually perform the puja itself. Okay, so the food and sweets don't go to waste, but they're not consumed by the devotees, and they're not consumed in a way that by the image as it would be in the Hindu tradition. So that's a very important distinction within the Jain tradition. Now, what do all these different substances mean, right? Do they have some kind of symbolic reference? Well, they do in some cases, and I've given you one with the rice and what the rice can stand for, right? But the rice itself, as we'll see, can also stand, just the substance of rice itself can stand for something completely different. There are many different interpretations, as Dundas points out, of what the Dravya substances mean. But what it's better to focus on, as we'll see in the next slide, is not the individual interpretations themselves, but the overall purpose of puja. And oftentimes, not just in the Jain tradition, but in Hindu traditions and Indic traditions more broadly, the meaning of something, like the linguistic or literal meaning of something, isn't always what's most important. What's usually most important is not what one believes or thinks about the meaning of something, but the actual act of performing it and carrying it out, right? So we can get some general overview of what things might mean, but what's most important is that this is carried out every day. The ritual itself, the somatic practice, the substance practice itself is what's more important. It reaffirms identity through a form of embodied and somatic knowledge that is beyond the level of discourse. Nevertheless, let's look at a few interpretations just for fun. Okay, Yashovijaya, a great medieval philosopher of the Jain tradition, said that the flowers in the form of a garland represent forgiveness, right? A very important part of the Jain tradition is to ask for forgiveness, for example, in pratikramana and other practices that we've looked at, to ask your teacher for forgiveness. You're asking or trying to represent some form of forgiveness for any transgressions that you may have made against nonviolence and other Jain principles. The incense, according to Yashovijaya, is representative of auspicious thoughts. Okay, so one has auspicious thoughts, and incense often invokes auspicious thoughts, does it not? When you walk into any place, yoga studio or temple that has incense burning. The light or the fire, right, the lamp waving that we saw in the video, represents the suppression of mental, vocal, and physical activity. You become so absorbed in the act of lamp waving and devotion to the image that your mental, vocal, and physical activity is suppressed, and therefore your karma can be burned, right? Because you're not identifying with your ego or anything like that. You're totally identified with giving devotion to what that Tirthankara stands for. Okay, so that's Yashovijaya. And now we'll move to Haribhadra. You may remember Haribhadra from before, one of the two Prabhavakas or eminent exalters of the Jain tradition. And there may have been two of them, right? As Dundas points out, there probably were two of them. Haribhadra said that numbers 1 through 5, so perfume, material, flowers, rice, incense, and light, stand for the 5 great vows. So each of those substances stands for one of the 5 great vows. So it reminds you every time you use it, it reinforces the idea that you need to be committed to nonviolence and so forth. The sweets represent devotion to your teacher. The fruit represents knowledge, right? And the water represents austerity, right? Now, because there are different lists and different interpretations, as Dundas points out again, it's interesting to look at what these meanings might be, but it's more interesting and perhaps better just to focus, especially at the introductory level, on the overall purpose of puja, some of which we've already discussed. The overall purpose, as is the case with Hinduism, is to give devoted attention to the image or the icon that one might give to a king, a guest, or a baby. Okay, so this is what the intentionality that one brings, the energy that one brings to their puja, is to give that kind of attention. Now, none of us have, I don't think any of us have given attention to a king before, but we can imagine what that must be like. You have to be very devoted and surrender, right? But we have probably given attention to guests, and a lot of us have probably given attention to babies or children, even if they're not our own children. And we know that when you give attention to a guest, for example, when you have someone over, you really wait on them, you're really hospitable. And in India, hospitality is incredible, right? People are incredibly hospitable in India and take you in and treat you like a god or goddess. And this is true, right? The same kind of attention that someone would give to a guest, and particularly in South Asia and India, is given to the image. You really wait on that image, make sure it's been fed, bathed, taken care of, it's comfortable. It's getting the attention that it needs. Same thing with a baby, right? A baby is totally helpless. You have to really wait on and care for every little single need of a baby. Give this devotion that you would give to a king, a guest, or a baby in puja as a Jain to the image of the Tirthankara or some other saintly image. Okay? Now, that being said, that applies to Hindu, Buddhist, Jain traditions, right? If you have some object that you're giving devotion to. But the Ford makers, we have to remember, within the Jain tradition, are not attached to the great attention that you're giving to them, because in order to be liberated, they had to overcome all of their attachments. The need to have attention is a huge attachment that we all have, right? We all want someone to pay attention to us at different times for different reasons. Children, adults, everyone wants to at least some amount of attention. Ford makers don't have that anymore, right? So what's the purpose of puja then? If you're not going to get anything from the Ford makers, if they don't care, if they're not going to intervene in human affairs, if you're not going to be able to elicit a response, as you see in the 5th bullet point here, what's the purpose of all this? Well, the purpose of all of this, again, is that in the ancient texts, first of all, it was a way to bring about a favorable future birth. Because as a layperson, you want to be born as an ascetic so that you could then be supported to achieve liberation. The image also represents, and this is really important, and I would say very relevant all the way to this day, the individual lay devotee's own inherent divinity, their soul, their jiva, and its potential to be liberated just as the soul of the Tirthankara has been liberated. That's fascinating, right? So you're giving devotion, you're giving puja with all these substances and all this great care, but you're not doing it for any other reason than to essentially inspire yourself to overcome yourself, to get over yourself, to get over your ego and all your attachments, and to try to become something like what that Tirthankara became. If not in this life, then in a future life. Now, that being said, outside of the sanctum, there are deities, and especially goddesses, but also gods, okay, other deities that are given offerings, sometimes asking for things in exchange. So Jains will often worship also Hindu gods and goddesses, asking for something to be given in return: wealth, prosperity, health, whatever it may be, right? But they will not ask the Tirthankaras for that. That's in the inner sanctum. In the inner sanctum, they are only going to purify themselves. On the outer sanctum, outside of the main sanctum, there are images of Hindu gods and goddesses, for example, who can give things if you give them something. A lot of this goes back to the early Common Era, where goddess worship was absorbed into the Jain tradition. Okay, as you recall, and we have the image up here on the right, the Jain tradition grew up alongside this culture that worshipped these tree spirits known as yakshas and yakshis, right? Male yakshas and female yakshis. These cults, or whatever you want to call them, these sects, these groups that worshipped these female and male gods and goddesses that were in these trees, eventually got absorbed into the Jain tradition. They didn't get rid of it, they just absorbed it, in some ways subordinated it, right, to the ultimate goal of soteriology, to be liberated. And that's why when you go into a Jain temple, the soteriological Tirthankara, the one that has been saved, has achieved salvation, is in the middle of the sanctum, while the yakshas and yakshis will either be subordinated to them within the temple or even outside of the temple, along with the other Hindu gods and goddesses. So you can see in the image to the right, you see the yaksha and the yakshi at the top. You see then an image of a Tirthankara here, and on both sides of the image, there's a yaksha and a yakshi attending to the Tirthankara below, right? So that sends a message. They're smaller and they're below. They're still part of the tradition, but the ultimate aim of the tradition is not just to get things, it's to achieve what that bigger image, that Tirthankara, has achieved at the top, right? Each Ford maker, as we've seen in many images throughout this lecture series, has a male yaksha and female yakshi attendant. So they'll have one on their sides flanking them, but ultimately, again, the concerns of the yaksha and yakshi cults to have things in this world are subordinated, though still important, especially, of course, within the lay community. The yakshis also have developed their own cults, as Dundas points out, or their own followings within the Jain tradition. For example, Padmavati is associated with Parshva. So Parshvanath is the 23rd Tirthankara, the one with the cobra hood that we saw a long while back, who saved the cobras from being burned in the fire to enact nonviolence. Padmavati is therefore associated with Parshva. Okay, there's a goddess that's associated with Parshva. And with Nemi, we remember Nemi, who saved the animals from being killed for his own wedding and then renounced, has Ambika with him, right? So these yakshis developed their own devotional cults alongside the Tirthankaras themselves. So we don't want to separate all these things out, right? And when you go to a Jain temple, such as the one in Southern California where I'm from, right, in Buena Park, for example, when you step outside the main sanctum, you will see images of other gods and goddesses that you can give devotion to for various things, right? One that I recall off the top of my head is the goddess of earth. I think it's Bhudevi is there, right? Who in the Hindu tradition is the goddess of the earth. Worshipped, but not worshipped as the central deity for Dravya Puja. That is reserved for the Tirthankaras on the inner sanctum of the temple, and that is the main concern, right? The main concern is the worship of the Tirthankaras, but these worship of lesser gods and goddesses does not completely disappear. And I think that makes the Jain tradition much more colorful and shows that it's a very vibrant devotional culture, right? With lay people, it's not that stereotypical, colorless, and austere thing that we saw in the first lecture, where we have these stereotypes coming from Hindus and from early Indologists. It's quite a fascinating devotional culture, and I highly recommend, when you get a chance, to visit a Jain temple and get a taste of this for yourself and see what this is like, because you'll see this in full power. There are also annual lay festivals. So in addition to the puja, right, that occurs on a regular basis, there are also annual lay festivals, right? And although they are less exuberant than Hindu festivals, there are big ones like Mahavir Jayanti, where Mahavir's birthday is celebrated every year. That's quite a festive occasion. And also for the Shvetambaras, they have the festival day of silence, right? So there's some days that will be, there are some forms of festival that will be silent and not as exuberant, right? As like the Hindu festival of Holi, where they're throwing colors all over the place. Jains will participate in that anyways, but the specifically Jain festivals are a mix, right? Some are very festive and some are also, you know, a little bit more subdued. Nevertheless, they do have these great festivals that, again, I recommend if you have a chance to participate in, that you do that. Some other important festivals, and some of which I'm talking about right now, are, for example, Paryushan for the Shvetambaras. This happens during Chaturmas, those 4 months of the Indian monsoon, usually occurs sometime in August or September. And during Paryushan, a lot of great auspicious things happen, including, as I've mentioned before, the asking for forgiveness from others, right? You say you're sorry for the things you've done, for the transgressions you've committed. You ask for forgiveness and you move on with an intentionality to be a better Jain, to be a better person, and to live like a true Jain, right? So Paryushan is a huge festival, very important within the Shvetambara tradition that goes on for multiple days. Number two, the Digambaras have Dasha Lakshana Parvan, which usually starts on the last day of Paryushan. This is the festival of 10 religious qualities. So there are certain qualities, the 10 qualities, the Dasha Lakshana, that must be cultivated to be a good Jain within the Digambara tradition. And what those are and how you do that, well, that's what you're reviewing and you're going back over during this festival of 10 religious qualities, during which 10 chapters of the Tattvartha Sutra, remember that canonical text for all Jains, are recited. Okay, so this is an annual festival to remind yourself of your religious commitments, similar to the Shvetambara. Number three, Diwali. Hindus celebrate Diwali. Okay, Diwali, many know, is the festival of lights, and you see an image of it here on the right, lamps being lit, and you see this all over India. It's a really incredible sight at night on Diwali to see all the little lamps all strewn throughout the streets. Hindus celebrate Diwali as a return in the Ramayana, the story, the great epic Ramayana, of Rama, the hero of the Ramayana, from the forest. He had been exiled to the forest by his father, and he's coming out after his many years of being in the forest to restore Dharma and to take his rightful place as the king of the kingdom, right? Hindus celebrate Diwali as that return of Rama from the forest. Now, that's a very Hindu story, right? Well, Jains also celebrate Diwali, and as I mentioned, Jain festivals often overlap or coincide with Hindu festivals. But Jains, in lighting the light, are commemorating the light that went out with Mahavira's death, right? So they're doing it for a different reason, but they're celebrating it just as the Hindus do, but they're doing it according to a different cultural logic. And it's to celebrate and commemorate Mahavira's light that he brought to the world that went out when he died. So they're reigniting that light symbolically. Okay, in addition to puja, in addition to festivals, lay people also carry out pilgrimage, just as Hindus do, right? Within the Jain community, they also carry out pilgrimages to holy places. But there are differences, again, between why they carry out these pilgrimages between the Jains and the Hindus, even though some of the names for things are the same. For example, tirthas, right? A tirtha is a place in general, as you see in bullet point number 1, that builds a bridge, right? And for the Jains, it builds a bridge between this world and the world of liberation. As Dundas points out, interestingly, Jain tirthas are not located near water bodies or rivers. Hindu tirthas are, right? So Jain tirthas are not. They're generally sectarian, so they'll either be controlled by some sect of the Shvetambara or some sect of the Digambara. Nevertheless, the purpose of these pilgrimage places is to allow the layperson, okay, to be an ascetic and live the life of an ascetic for a short period of time. Right? So this might involve walking a long distance, right, to burn some karma, going without food and water for a little while during your pilgrimage to get to that place, that very important place. It gives lay Jains a chance to burn some of their karma, even though they're not full-on ascetics. Now, as Dundas also points out, and we're going to look at these two sects of Shvetambras in a future lecture, the Stanakavasi, as you see in bullet point 3, and the Terapanti don't make pilgrimage. Okay, why is that? Well, they both reject temple and icon worship, right? A pilgrimage usually goes to a place with some image or significance that requires some form of devotion, like a temple or even a physical place, right? Or an image of a physical, and we'll see some of those in a minute, of a physical Tirthankara. We'll see some on a future slide. Instead, the Stanakavasi and the Terapanti, who are aniconic, who reject the worship of images, instead say that the monks and the nuns within their sects are the pilgrimage place themselves. Those are the people you go to for pilgrimage. You go to the people themselves, you hear the teachings from these people, you support these people, these ascetics. You don't go to worship an image or a temple. And again, we'll look at them in more detail in the future, but it's an important distinction to make. Here to the right in this image, we have a map of Rajasthan. And within Rajasthan, we see all of these little tirthas, all these little Jain holy places that one can visit, right? So that's just one small example, and there are many others. Gujarat, we'll see, and other places around India, where Jains go in order to carry out pilgrimage and visit holy places. Now, there's also important distinctions between Jain pilgrimage places and Buddhist pilgrimage places, okay? The Buddha's remains, so like his bones and his teeth and various parts of the Buddha, were placed around India in different pilgrimage sites, right? They created pilgrimage sites because there you have the remains of a great, great spiritual master, right? And people still will visit those things to this day. Mahavira, however, according to Jain belief, had his bones carried to heaven when he died, right? By Indra. His bones went to heaven. So if his bones are in heaven, they're no longer here on earth. There's no place in the physical world where you can go like you can for the Buddha and be with some remains of Mahavira. You just simply can't do that, right? So these Buddhist stupas that you see, for example, this one here in Sanchi, where you would go for pilgrimage for some, because there's either some aspect of the Buddha there or some aspect of a Buddhist saint or something. You don't have that in the Jain tradition, right? Ford makers, as you see in bullet point number 2, are not physically accessible. They are not physically accessible because their remains are not here on earth. They're in heaven. Therefore, how do you establish a Jain holy place? Well, in the Jain tradition, what's unique about the Jain tradition is rather than having the remains of Mahavira or some other Jain saint, these places are either established because someone was enlightened there, one of the Tirthankaras or the Kevalins was enlightened there. 2, because somebody performed a miracle within the Jain tradition there. Or 3, and this often happens, an image appears there of a Tirthankara most often, right? Usually these images that are still sometimes found, to this day, were buried, probably because they're being hidden from the Muslims and so on and so forth. But if you find that image in a particular place, it shows that there was some form of Jain devotional activity that was taking place there before, and then it reinvests that place as a holy place of pilgrimage, right? Because there's a Jain image found there from ancient times or from medieval times that would invest the place with some form of significance. So rather than being invested with significance because it has the remains of a Tirthankara or Ford maker, Jain holy places are established due to enlightenment, miracles, or the appearance of an image of a Tirthankara. 2 of the most famous holy Jain sites in India, we'll look at 2 of them right now, are Mount Shatrunjaya, also called Pundarika, in Palitana, Gujarat. And if you go to the International School for Jain Studies, which I highly recommend that you do, sometimes, and I believe it's in their winter program, they will take you to Palitana. Some of my students have gone to Palitana with this group, and they tell me really how incredibly beautiful it is. And I think you can see from the image to the right that it is quite beautiful. Palitana means the hill which conquers enemies, right? It was established around 1006 of the Common Era, so it's very old. It's over 1,000 years old. And it is said that Urshaba's son, Bharata, and his grandson, Pundarika, which the hill is also named after, were both liberated there. So you can see that this place is invested, as I just showed on the previous slide, with significance for the Jains as a pilgrimage site, because two significant people within the tradition, Urshiba's son and grandson, achieved liberation there, right? Urshiba is the first Tirthankara. That invests this place with a lot of authority and makes it an important place to go. It is said by people in multiple accounts, right, that animals give up violence in this pilgrimage site. Animals give up violence. Animals overcome their nature, right, their animalistic nature. That's a pretty profound thing to believe in or to witness, right? If you see animals giving up violence there. As you can see in the image, there are quite a number of shrines, temples. You see here there are about 1,000 throughout Mount Shatrunjaya. And in 2019, meat and eggs were actually illegalized there. So it is illegal to sell or consume meat or eggs since 2019 at Mount Shatrunjaya. Pretty fascinating, right? So this is really a place where nonviolence is promoted. You can be inspired to practice nonviolence through your diet, and where it is protected. The second of the two most famous Jain holy sites is Shravana Belgola, the White Lake of the Ascetics. In 600 CE, we've already seen Shravana Belgola, right? We saw it when the great image here of Bahubali was bathed every 10 to 15 years. We saw a video of that in a previous lecture. But in 600 CE, we have the earliest inscription there. And this is in Karnataka in South India, right? And what this inscription commemorates is the journey of a great Digambara teacher, Bhadrabahu, who we also talked about before, who with his disciples came from the north to escape a famine and brought this prestigious northern culture that integrated with Karnataka and with Tamil Nadu and integrated with the kings and with the literary culture of South India, as we saw before. Now, whether or not this inscription is telling a true story is not known, but it does commemorate this teacher and this journey that this teacher took from the north, probably on account of a famine. And as we saw before, some Jains went to the west in North India when they started to move for various reasons, and some came south. So in 600 CE, there's an inscription here that says that a great teacher, Bhadrabahu, came with his disciples, probably because of a famine, for those who went south, right? Before the great image that you see here was built, of Bahubali, this was a famous site for Salekana. We saw in one of the previous lectures that Salekana is the process through which an ascetic will starve themselves to death, stop drinking, right? So stop food, stop drinking, and eventually relinquish their breath. It's a very intentional path to death to liberate one's soul from the body, right? It's intentional. So you're not just dying, you're intentionally giving yourself over and relinquishing any violence on the world. For that reason, this place was already invested with a lot of spiritual significance for Jains, right? Because so many holy people undertook this process of Salekana on this holy site. So before the image of Bahubali was there even, it was already a significant site. And then, as you'll recall, Bahubali was built here. And why was Bahubali built here during the medieval period? Well, as you remember, the story of Bahubali is that he defeated his brother Bharata. His brother Bharata was trying to take the kingdom from him and from his brothers. He defeated his brother, but then he felt bad about it and for the violence that he had to inflict as a king, and he went and he achieved liberation by standing still in the posture that you see him standing in here in Kayot Sarga for a year. The creepers grew around him, the anthill grew at the bottom of his foot, and due to his overcoming of his passions, he achieved liberation, right? So this site is significant for Jains for both of those reasons. One, because so many saints and sages and ascetics undertook the process of Salekana, voluntary starving themselves to death in the perfection of nonviolence. And two, because Bahubali and the commemoration of Bahubali is carried out here. And every 10 to 15 years, there is that Mastaka Abhisheka, where the image is bathed in all of those really expensive substances. And even now, as Dundas points out, flowers will be dropped from helicopters to adorn this image during that great celebration. So this brings us to the end of our second lecture of the Jain layperson. We've looked at the Dravya Puja and all the various substances that are used in devotional worship, pilgrimage sites, how pilgrimage sites are established. We've looked at festivals briefly, And we can see that the Jain life, again, especially the lay life, is very, very vibrant, very colorful, and very celebratory. This will conclude the ascetic and the Jain lectures, and we're going to move forward for a couple of more lectures to look at some aspects of philosophy as well as the way that Jains have integrated into the present. I look forward to seeing you then.